Against the picturesque landscapes of Oregon, a gruesome tale of paranoia, chaos, and murder unfolds, starting out innocently enough. Valerie Faust, having worked as a guide at a remote cave resort for a long time, is ready to change careers. So, on her last night on the job, Valerie decides to go wild at a party. The wilderness, dark, gloomy caves, a wild party in a cabin from which it's impossible to leave. What could go wrong? 2 murders, one real, the other a product of filmmakers' imagination. Become so entangled that to solve the case, detectives had to review numerous videos featuring their prime suspect. Shane Moore was the middle child of a family of 5. His sister Kelly was 4 years younger than him. The brother and sister had been competing with each other from an early age. So, when Shane decided to go to law school in California, Kelly enrolled there too. In the early 90s, Kelly was already working as a corporate lawyer, while Shane realized that it wasn't for him. He opened an antique bookstore in San Francisco. He read every book he sold, which helped him with sales. It was a successful business. Of course, his sister couldn't let her brother surpass her in the literary field, so she and her husband, actor Dan Reed, wrote a book called Fatal Medicine about Janine Jones, a serial killer. The book was quite successful. Some publications recognized it as a bestseller, and in 1991, it was adapted for television. A month after the book's publication, their first child was born, a girl named Aisling Tucker Moore Reed, who everyone called Tucker. The couple soon had 2 more children, but the bond between the mother and her eldest daughter was special. Everyone noticed this. Tucker grew up in a very artistic environment. Kelly surrounded her with love and support, attended all her performances, did her makeup, hairstyles, and outfits. Kelly put her career on hold for the sake of her daughter's future career. By 2000, she and her husband had divorced, and since Kelly was not working, her parents supported her financially. In fact, they provided for her and her children. They gave her a set amount every month and bought a charming house near the ranch in Oregon where they themselves settled. It was a beautiful ranch, located on 150 acres of land. Also in 2000, Shane moved in with his parents to take care of their sick father. Kelly and Shane's father had once served as a Navy admiral, but now he was suffering from amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. For 6.5 years, Shane took care of his father and did all the work on the ranch. Although he and Kelly still didn't always see eye to eye, Uncle Shane was his niece Tucker's biggest fan. He was very proud of her performances in local productions and often talked about it to his friends. As Tucker grew older, she joined a rock band, sang, acted, created costumes, and wrote articles for the newspaper. Together with her mother and younger sister, she wrote a book in her teenage years, which became the first in a series and was also popular. But one event severely darkened the previously happy life of the young woman. After graduating from high school in 2010, Tucker enrolled at the University of Southern California, a prestigious institution known for training journalists, actors, and theater performers. However, an unforeseen event disrupted her dreams. Tucker was dating a young man who, according to her, wanted to take their relationship to a more intimate level, but she wasn't ready for that. He insisted and essentially got his way. The girl accused him of assault and filed a police report. However, neither the university, the police, nor the prosecutor's office found evidence of his guilt, but Tucker decided to go further. At the university, she was a reporter and editor of the student newspaper, and also ran a blog called All in Bandages. The blog no longer exists, but in it Tucker, who spoke out against violence, shared her experiences. She also founded a coalition against violence at the university. This brought a lot of attention to her story. The blog was quite helpful overall, with Tucker sharing useful articles and resources for other girls. However, she mentioned the name of her alleged assailant, and after she failed to get support from the university, the police, or the prosecutor's office, the young man filed a counterclaim. She had to delete all posts about him. They settled the matter in court, but the incident left a mark on her. Tucker dropped out of school and returned to Oregon, where she got a job as a reporter. At first, everything was going well, but gradually the rivalry between Kelly and Shane resumed. Kelly had her own vision of how the ranch should be managed to be profitable. The relationship became tense, arguments became frequent, and on July 26, 2016, an emergency call was received from an agitated woman reporting that Shane Moore was lying on the porch injured and in urgent need of medical help. The woman who called identified herself as Carla Triber, a notary. She heard the shot, but didn't know who fired or how badly Shane was injured. She refused to go out on the porch to check if he was alive. However, she handed the phone to Carlton Olson, Shane's neighbor, who began to assist the man. following the operator's instructions. It was very important for someone to try to help the injured man. The ranch was located 35 kilometers from the nearest hospital, and it took the medics half an hour to reach the victim. Unfortunately, this was too long a period to help him. The man died from a single gunshot wound to the chest. When the police arrived, they detained everyone present at the ranch, at least to question them. However, the woman who had called emergency services, notary Carla Treiber, was not at the ranch. She was in such a panic that after handing the phone to Carlton Olson, she fled the scene. When the police managed to contact her, she stated that she did not witness the shooting personally, but knew who was not on the porch at the time of the shot. According to her, Shane, Tucker, and Kelly were on the porch. When the police questioned 59-year-old Kelly, she unleashed all her hatred on her dead brother. Kelly claimed that Shane was the black sheep of the family. She alleged that he not only used illegal substances, but also manufactured them on the ranch. The woman told the police that she and her daughter were forced to move to the ranch due to her brother's dangerous behavior because they feared for their aging mother. However, Shane supposedly perceived their presence as a threat. 9 months prior, the tension had reached a breaking point. In September 2015, Tucker, who was not shy about using strong language, insulted her uncle. Shane took a plastic oil can and, in a fit of rage, threw it at the door behind which the girl was standing. The door was closed, but was essentially just a protective screen, so the oil can flew through it and hit Tucker in the face. Of course, she filed a complaint against her uncle. He was charged with 4th-degree domestic violence and was prohibited from contacting his niece. Kelly told the detectives that this only infuriated Shane further, and his threats increased. She claimed that he threatened to kill them if Tucker didn't drop the charges. According to Kelly, the man went into a rage upon learning that she had invited an appraiser to assess the value of the ranch. She wanted to sell it, and Shane, who lived on the ranch, was not thrilled with the idea. However, regarding the specific moment of the shooting, Kelly refused to testify, stating that the trauma of the incident prevented her from remembering what happened and who shot Shane. 26-year-old Tucker, on the other hand, claimed that she shot her uncle in self-defense. Through tears, she assured the detectives that she did not intend to shoot and thought she had to cock the hammer before firing. The detectives immediately found this statement strange. What did she expect to achieve by pulling the trigger, sincerely believing that there would be no shot? A little later, the girl admitted that she had found the revolver, which most likely belonged to her grandfather. Tucker wanted to check if it was loaded, so she went out onto the porch and fired it. She then handed it to her mother, who placed it in a room under a napkin so the notary wouldn't be scared by the sight of the weapon. Thus, the women prepared everything in case they needed to protect the house. Tucker was arrested on charges of manslaughter. She posted bail the next morning and was released from jail. Tucker and her mother firmly stuck to the story they told the police. They claimed they were afraid of Shane, and Tucker shot him to protect herself and her mother. However, certain aspects puzzled the police. The fact is, on that fateful day, it wasn't the notary who first called emergency services, but Shane. He called 911 at 1:40 p.m. because he himself was frightened. Shane told the operator that Tucker had fired a gun that morning and he took it as a warning. He explained to the operator that he was expecting the notary's arrival, and given his relationship with his sister and niece and the fact that Tucker chose that day to practice shooting, he asked if he could count on the sheriff's presence because he was scared and didn't want any trouble. Unfortunately, the police don't get involved in such domestic disputes, and the sheriff didn't respond to his request by sending an officer to the ranch. Additionally, investigators were puzzled by the fact that when Shane was killed, he had no weapon, and he wasn't even standing near the door. He was almost 2 meters away from it. Furthermore, Tucker shot the man straight in the chest. Moreover, when specialists examined the murder weapon, they found other controversial points. Based on the state of the revolver, it had been fired only once. But Tucker herself confirmed that she fired it in the morning. This means that before Shane's murder, someone had removed the spent shell and reloaded the weapon so it was fully loaded. Suddenly, Tucker's statements didn't sound as truthful and innocent. This indicated premeditation in the crime. The police needed an outside perspective on the family dynamics, so they contacted Shane and Kelly's brother, Ryan. After talking to him, the main characters in this case revealed themselves from a new angle. Ryan considered Shane the kindest and most pleasant member of their family. Like Kelly, he had moved closer to their parents, but unlike her, he was not idle. All the work on the ranch relied on him. He tended to the garden, the forest, the house, and took care of their sick father and then their elderly mother after their father's death. After both parents passed away, the ranch was supposed to be split equally between Kelly and Shane. Other family members, including Ryan, did not lay claim to the ranch at all. However, Kelly was clearly not satisfied with this and came up with various ways to squeeze everything she could out of the ranch right away, thereby encroaching on her brother's share as well. After their father's death, Kelly forced their mother to take out loans and credits from the bank. Additionally, the ranch was adorned with a magnificent forest, which Kelly wanted to sell for timber. Naturally, Shane disliked all these actions because the loans and the plan to cut down the forest could greatly devalue the ranch, and accordingly, his share of the inheritance. The ranch was worth $6 million. In other words, Kelly was dipping into not only her inheritance, but also Shane's. It got to the point where Kelly tried to include a condition in their mother's will stating that if Shane harmed her or her family, he would immediately lose his right to inheritance. Aggressive behavior would include not only attacking the women, but even damaging their car. Learning about his sister's cunning plans, Shane wanted their mother to rewrite the ranch to both him and Kelly now, splitting it 50-50. Of course, he would continue to take care of their mother, but would be sure that Kelly would stop her encroachments. And their mother agreed. She was ready to sign such a document. That was precisely why Shane had invited the notary to the ranch that day. In other words, Shane died on the very day he was supposed to get what he wanted. Regarding Ryan's relationship with Kelly, he said they stopped talking after a family celebration. He directly accused his sister of taking advantage of their parents, after which she attacked him with a fireplace poker. According to him, Tucker's temperament was no different from her mother's. The police also interviewed Stacy McKenzie, another of Shane's neighbors. Once again, her words contradicted the testimonies of Kelly and Tucker. She said that Shane was the one who lived in fear, not his sister and niece. On the day he died, Shane was plagued by bad premonitions. That morning, he told Stacy that he was afraid he was going to die. So, when she heard a shot in the middle of the day, Stacy ran outside and found Shane lying on the porch. She couldn't believe her eyes. Her friend was lying in a pool of blood, gasping in pain. Tucker was standing over him with a revolver in her hand, shouting, "Just die already!" Tucker was angry that Shane was taking too long to die. Hearing her words, her mother shouted, "What? He's not dead yet? Why aren't you dead yet, Shane?" And all of this was accompanied by obscene language. Stacy also mentioned that Kelly was the greediest person she had ever known. Kelly didn't believe that her brother genuinely cared for their parents and thought it was just a ploy to get all the inheritance. But in reality, after their mother's death, Shane wanted to take his half of the ranch's value in cash and simply move away from his sister. To avoid any disputes over the will, he wanted to settle everything now. Despite all the facts uncovered by the investigators, the police lacked evidence that conclusively proved Tucker's actions were intentional. Therefore, the prosecution could only charge her with involuntary manslaughter, and most likely she would be acquitted, with her actions deemed self-defense. However, 6 months later, detectives received unexpected help from Tucker herself. Her lawyer approached the prosecution and handed over a video. He accompanied it with an explanation that the video unequivocally proved it was self-defense. He assured them Tucker would be immediately acquitted. But when the prosecutors reviewed the video, they came to the opposite conclusion. Tucker was filming the video. She was providing commentary on what was happening. The girl filmed the room where the notary, Kelly's mother, and Tucker herself were present. She captured how her uncle approached the house and peered inside from a distance through the window. Throughout this time, she insisted he was dangerous. However, it was difficult to believe this because the man walked very slowly past the house, unarmed, in flip-flops and a t-shirt. He did nothing and did not come close to the windows. During this time, her mother started shouting that she thought the notary had been invited to add an additional clause to the will. Therefore, she tore up the prepared document. Apparently, the man saw Kelly tear up the paper prepared by the notary or heard his sister's loud cries and approached the front door. He opened it slightly and asked what was going on. But he did not enter the house, and as soon as he heard that his niece, whom he was forbidden to approach, was inside, he stepped back onto the porch. Kelly and Tucker raised a terrible racket. Tucker yelled for her mother to get the gun. Kelly ran to the door, and Tucker dashed for the pistol, which was under a napkin, and also ran to the front door. She yelled, "Get out of here!" and fired. Apparently, her mother was only pretending to fight with her brother at the front door as he was found too far away from her. According to the police, Kelly opened the door, but Shane was not behind her. However, this did not stop her. She shot her unarmed uncle directly in the chest. After that, there were terrible screams from the mortally wounded man. From the room where the notary and Kelly's mother remained, the front door was not visible. However, the notary confirmed that Shane did not enter the house. After viewing the video, the prosecution charged 28-year-old Tucker with first-degree murder. When she was denied bail, Tucker reacted in a highly theatrical manner. She pretended to faint and screamed behind the courtroom doors. Her wails could be heard far beyond the room. It's hard to believe, but the story gets even more intriguing. After the bail hearing, a local filmmaker approached the police. He explained that after Tucker was released on bail 2 years ago, she had starred in his film titled From the Dark. The film crew had no idea that she was charged with involuntary manslaughter because they didn't check the actors' backgrounds. Moreover, she went by the stage name Vin Reed. Vin Reed, or Tucker Moore Reed, played the lead role of Valerie Faust in the film. Valerie had worked as a tour guide in Oregon caves for many years, but decided to let loose at her farewell party. Unexpectedly, Valerie finds herself armed in the darkness, illuminated only by the light from her phone's flashlight. Suddenly, another person emerges from the darkness, trying to calm her down and persuade her to hand over the weapon, but consumed by fear and panic, she shoots him. She believes it's self-defense, but in reality, Valerie has killed him. The similarities between the film's plot and her real-life crime are simply chilling. Investigators couldn't believe it. First, Tucker personally filmed herself killing her uncle. Then, after being released on bail for this crime, she read the script, auditioned, and starred in the lead role in a film that almost completely mirrors the murder she committed. But watching her performance in court as a defendant charged with first-degree murder was not possible. The prosecution feared they might not win the case. Surely, among the 12 jurors, there would be at least one who would believe Tucker's claim that she was afraid of her uncle. Therefore, Tucker was allowed to plead guilty to involuntary manslaughter, and the charge of first-degree murder was dropped. In 2020, the 30-year-old woman was sentenced to 6 years in prison. She filed an appeal, but it was rejected. Interestingly, before she agreed to the plea deal with the prosecutor, additional charges were brought against her. While awaiting trial in prison, during a search on January 1, 2020, prohibited substances were found in her belongings in her cell, some of the strongest and most dangerous among them. Tucker was charged with possession of prohibited substances and contraband. This woman literally gives the prosecution evidence against herself. First, she provided them with a video proving her guilt in her uncle's murder, and then she continued to break the law in prison before the trial began. Nevertheless, considering the time Tucker spent in prison before her trial, she could be released as early as November 25, 2024, when she will be 35 years old. Her mother, Kelly, was not charged because investigators could not find evidence of conspiracy, although they couldn't shake the thought that she played not a minor role in this. She still lives in Oregon in a house bought for her by her parents, close to her beloved mother. A warm spring evening stood on Saturday, April 11, 2015. Weekends were always lively in the small town of South Bend, Indiana. South Bend is an idyllic place known for its Midwest charm, something more populated regions have lost. With the University of Notre Dame just minutes away, the streets were filled with students every Friday and Saturday evening, eager to relax with a glass of course, non-alcoholic beer at a bar. A regular at such establishments, 22-year-old Alma Del Real was also spending the evening with friends. Alma was interested in fashion and makeup, and that night, as always, she looked impeccable. She wore a black crop top, a leather jacket, light-ripped jeans, and her signature high-heeled black shoes. She was impossible to miss, and one person was determined to win her favor, no matter what it took. On the afternoon of April 13, 2015, a worried woman called the South Bend, Indiana police. She identified herself as Susana Lagunas and explained that she was concerned about her niece, 22-year-old Alma Del Real, because no one had been able to contact her for over 48 hours. The last time her aunt saw Alma was on Friday, April 10th. Alma had called her that morning and suggested they grab a coffee during her lunch break. Wanting to save them both some money, Susana brewed coffee at home and brought it to the bank where her niece worked as a teller. Alma was usually quite busy on weekends, so Susana wasn't surprised that she hadn't heard from her for a couple of days. But when Monday came and Alma didn't show up for work, Susana became worried. Alma never missed work without a reason. She was very responsible and could always be relied upon. Moreover, she had recently received a promotion at work, which made Susanna think that her niece might be in trouble. She tried contacting her repeatedly, but all her attempts were unsuccessful. But who was Alma, and who would want her to disappear? Alma was born on October 15, 1992, in Guadalajara, the capital of the state of Jalisco in Mexico. It's the second most populous city in Mexico, known for the birthplace of mariachi music and tequila, and filled with grand architectural structures that could make any less impressive American city feel modest. However, behind these majestic Gothic buildings lurked a dark force, the cartels. They thrived in the state capital in the late 1980s. The situation was worsened by the difficulty of finding decent, well-paying jobs, prompting Alma's mother to make a difficult decision. Her parents had already settled in the U.S., and hoping for a better future for her daughter, she sent her 10-year-old daughter to them. Her grandparents surrounded their granddaughter with love, and soon she felt at home in Indiana. Her aunts, Susana and Gabriela del Real, also lived nearby and were ready to help their niece at any moment. Grateful for the opportunities provided to her, Alma worked hard both in her studies and part-time jobs. By the age of 15, she was juggling several jobs at once, partly to support her family financially, but also because she was a workaholic who didn't want to let life slip by. Over the years, she developed various interests. She enjoyed acting in school plays and later dreamed of opening a dance studio. Finally, she found her true calling working behind the scenes, discovering the roles of professional makeup artists and hairstylists. She was saving up for college, as training cost money. Despite the effort she put into work and school, Alma always found time for her family and friends. Therefore, by Monday, April 13th, Susanna wasn't the only one persistently trying to contact her. Other friends and relatives also received no answers to their calls and messages, not to mention her social media accounts. Alma was very active on various platforms, but there had been no new activity for over 2 days. Alma's loved ones couldn't believe she would just disappear without telling anyone, but that alone wasn't enough to initiate a police investigation. All they knew was that she had missed work and hadn't used her credit cards for 2 days. So they decided to search her home, hoping to find something that might help them understand what happened. The house was locked, with no signs of forced entry. Inside, everything appeared normal. There was no indication of a struggle. The bed was made. The only things missing were her purse and phone. Otherwise, it was a typical home for a 22-year-old woman. In other words, the state of the house didn't suggest a crime had occurred. The police were puzzled by the testimony of one witness, Alma's colleague and friend, Crystal Rangel. The two had planned to go to a cosmetics trade conference in Chicago, so on Sunday morning, Crystal arrived at Alma's house to pick her up. She waited in her car, expecting Alma to come out, but when she didn't, Crystal went to the door and knocked. However, there was no answer. Crystal was very surprised because Alma had been eager to go to Chicago, and they had planned the trip well in advance. Moreover, Alma was interested in becoming a distributor for a cosmetics company and had scheduled business meetings at the conference. The officers pondered the possibility that the made bed might indicate that no one had slept in it, suggesting something happened to Alma before 9:30 a.m. on Sunday. However, it was crucial to establish a more precise time of her disappearance. To understand what happened, the police focused on Alma's activities on April 11th. She had a busy day, starting with a visit to her other aunt, Maribel del Real. They chatted for a while before Alma left. Her aunt thought she was heading home, but wasn't certain. At 9 p.m., Alma met up with friends. They first stopped by Brothers Bar for a few drinks, then went dancing at Studio Rumba. Witnesses confirmed that they arrived at the club around 1:30 a.m. Alma was memorable to many patrons and staff at the venues because she had previously worked at the club, and the staff and owner knew her personally. The club's security guard was a bit concerned about Alma since she appeared to have drunk quite a bit. But since she was with friends, he assumed they would take care of her. Besides that, Alma caught the attention of some guys who wanted to get to know her, dance, or buy her a cocktail, but no one noticed anything unusual. No one behaved inappropriately towards her or followed her around. After dancing for a couple of hours, Alma and her friends decided to call it a night, and by 3:20 a.m., everyone had gone home. Alma was dropped off at home by her old friend, 24-year-old Alberto Cruz. Since she lived near the club, they arrived at around 3:30 a.m. During an interview at the police station, Alberto recounted that when they got there, he naturally offered to walk Alma to her door, but she declined, saying it wasn't necessary. It was a very quiet neighborhood, and she was just a few steps from her house, so he felt confident nothing would happen to her. Additionally, Alma was very independent, so he didn't argue. Feeling tired and eager to sleep, he drove off as soon as Alma closed the car door behind her. He didn't see her enter the house. A few minutes later, Alma tried to contact him via a FaceTime call. Alberto assumed she wanted to grab a bite to eat, which was common after a night out when one starts looking for the nearest McDonald's. But he was so tired and wanted to go home and sleep that he ignored the call. Now, he wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. The investigators also speculated that this could have been Alma's final cry for help. They checked Alberto's phone, and everything matched his statements. Additionally, he was very forthcoming during the conversation. From their discussion with him, investigators concluded two things. Although Alberto was not involved in Alma's disappearance, he did not see her enter the house. This meant that someone could have followed her and attacked her on the steps of her home or been waiting inside. The abductor would have had a long 6-hour window until Crystal arrived to pick her up. Seeing that the investigation was not making any progress, Alma's family and friends decided to take on the task of informing the public about the case. They showed incredible solidarity, organizing marches, distributing flyers, raising money for a reward for information about Alma, and gathering volunteers for search efforts. They also created a social media page with updates on the case. This kept the issue in the public eye and in the news. Their active efforts paid off, and tips began to come into the police. One of these tips particularly intrigued and concerned the detectives. The police received a call from a man who claimed to know what had happened to Alma and where she was. He reported that she had become a victim of human trafficking. The man recounted that he was at a local Kmart and overheard 5 other men discussing her disappearance. One of them allegedly said that his brother had kidnapped Alma and sold her to people holding her in Ohio. The caller also claimed to have seen Alma there personally. Given the gravity of the accusation and the involvement of another state, FBI agents were brought into the investigation. The witness knew the name of one of the 5 suspects, and through social media, the agents identified the names of the other alleged accomplices. They also tracked their movements over the past few weeks. It was found that none of them had recently been in Ohio. Just as the investigators were about to dismiss the witness's testimony, another tip came in, eerily similar to the previous one. Another witness reported that Alma had been seen in Chicago. She was with a man who appeared to be trying to hide her from others, and it seemed that she was with him against her will. The particular hotel where this was observed was known to often employ women in the oldest profession. Fearing that the young woman might be moved somewhere else, the FBI agents immediately set out. They also requested assistance from local police. Upon arrival, the agents met with a detective who informed them that not only was local police aware of a woman who might be in danger, but they were already investigating the matter. The agents showed him Alma's photo, and the detective agreed that she looked like the woman from the hotel, but it was not her. The woman from the hotel was a local runaway whom the detective knew well and who was now safe. Thus, it turned out to be an incredible coincidence. Although investigators were relieved not to be chasing ghosts, Alma Del Real's disappearance case returned to the same point it was before. They had been investigating for 4 weeks, but had only established a rough time frame for Alma's disappearance. Nothing more. Detectives decided to review all the facts from the beginning and re-interview witnesses. After talking again with patrons and staff from the bar and club where Alma spent the evening of April 11th, they returned to the young man who drove her home, Alberto Cruz. This was not their first conversation with him, but each time Alberto had cooperated fully, answering questions and following police requests, even though it was clear he was very tired. He once again recounted the trip from the nightclub to Alma's home. Alma had asked him not to walk her to the door, so he left, and a few minutes later she called him on a video call, which he did not hear due to the loud radio. He was very tired and went straight home. However, the detective noticed a new detail. Alberto had previously stated that he heard the call but ignored it. It seemed like a small detail, but it caught the attention of the investigators. Criminals could be caught on even smaller discrepancies. They still believed Alberto's account, but a seed of doubt had been planted. Detectives requested that Alberto take a polygraph test and also conduct a more thorough examination of his phone. Reluctantly, he agreed. The polygraph indicated that he had attempted to evade answering questions. The phone check proved even more intriguing. Previously, police officers had only conducted a superficial examination of the man's phone. Now, they thoroughly reviewed his movements that night. They were shocked to discover that Alberto did not head straight home after dropping off his friend. His phone remained near her house for over 2 hours. He only left at 5:30 a.m., and instead of heading home, he traveled 60 kilometers south to the town of Culver. He spent about an hour there before finally returning home. When detectives confronted Alberto with this new information, he initially stuck to his version of events. However, realizing that his explanations were not convincing, he eventually recounted a story he hoped would extricate him from the situation. According to Alberto, when he and Alma arrived at her house, they were ambushed by criminals. These were members of a gang working for a Mexican cartel. Someone in Alma's family owed the cartel a large sum of money, and they decided to take revenge. They grabbed Alma and ordered Alberto to leave if he didn't want to share her fate. The abductors took his phone, put Alma in his car, and drove off. Alberto had no choice but to return home on foot. He did not report the cartel or the kidnapping of Alma to anyone and went to sleep. In the morning, to his surprise, his car was parked almost next to his house. His phone was on the passenger seat, and he found the keys in the ignition. Who would have thought that Mexican cartel members would be so considerate? Detectives did not believe Alberto's story and interrogated him for several hours, but he insisted that Alma had been kidnapped by order of the Mexican cartel. Detectives consulted with one of the most experienced police officers, who advised them to directly ask Alberto where the girl was. They had nothing to lose in any case. So one detective returned to the interrogation room and gently asked Alberto, "Do you want to get out of here?" Naturally, Alberto responded, "Yes." The detective then said, "Let's go for a drive and you can show me where she is." Clearly exhausted and somewhat deflated, Alberto had no strength left to resist. As they drove, the detective realized they were heading towards the city of Culver, where Alberto had traveled early in the morning of April 12th. They arrived at an area with thick vegetation on both sides of the road. There, the suspect asked to stop and, pointing out the window, said, "She's over there." He remained in the car, sobbing quietly. 20 to 30 meters from the road, the police found the body. Alma was lying face down among particularly dense undergrowth. Because the body was in a terrible state, Alma could only be identified after an autopsy. Alberto was charged with the girl's murder. However, even now, he refused to admit his guilt or explain what had happened. At the trial, Alberto abandoned his previous cartel story and presented a different account. This new version was closer to the truth, but still sought to shift part of the blame onto the victim. Alberto claimed that on the night of April 11th, Alma invited him inside when they arrived at her home. There, according to Alberto, they engaged in intimate relations. Afterwards, Alma allegedly began blackmailing him, threatening to reveal everything to his girlfriend. A quarrel and struggle ensued. During the altercation, Alma fell to the floor and hit her head. Alberto claimed he realized she was dying, panicked, and strangled her to prevent her from suffering. He then attempted to cover up the incident. The prosecutor thoroughly dismantled Alberto's new version of events. Although Alma's body was in such a state that the exact cause of death could not be precisely determined, the forensic expert concluded that Alma had not suffered a severe blow to the head. There was no evidence of cranial damage. Instead, the prosecution's version accounted for all the evidence and witness testimonies. Alberto had been obsessed with Alma and had a history of following her around and attempting to engage her romantically, despite knowing her feelings were not mutual. Witnesses testified that Alberto was fixated on Alma, having observed her dating various young men, and that he realized he would never be in their place. Faced with the rejection, he decided to force his way into a romantic relationship with her. The horror Alma must have felt when her childhood friend turned into a monster and attacked her with the most vile intentions was unimaginable. The prosecution could not state with absolute certainty, but it was highly likely that Alberto had assaulted Alma and then strangled her to prevent her from telling anyone what had happened. The jury deliberated for less than 90 minutes before siding with the prosecution. In May 2016, Alberto Cruz was found guilty of Alma del Real's murder and sentenced to 60 years in prison. He will be eligible for parole no earlier than May 16, 2060. The impact on Alma's family was devastating. Not only had she been murdered, but her life was taken by someone they had once considered a close friend. They had never suspected Alberto. He had not only feigned innocence during interrogations, but had also actively participated in the search for Alma. He personally reassured her family that she would be found. They trusted him and genuinely believed he was a friend. Alma's aunt, Susanna, reveals that the hardest part of the trial was witnessing the reaction of Alberto's family, who were, in a sense, also grieving for the loss of a son. Despite her own grief, Susanna found the strength to empathize with the family of the murderer. This speaks volumes about the kind and compassionate people Alma was surrounded by, and reflects the kind of person Alma herself was. The most heartbreaking aspect of this story is that Alma could not have done anything differently to change the outcome. As a young and beautiful woman who wanted to protect herself, she did everything right. She was enjoying herself with friends in a place where even the staff and owner knew her well, and then she asked a person she had trusted for years to take her home. In other words, it is possible to do everything correctly, but a monster like Alberto can still find a way to invade your life. No one will ever know what Alma del Real could have achieved in the future, but knowing how dedicated, persistent, and hardworking she was, it is certain that her potential would have been extraordinary.
Medford is a small town near Boston, Massachusetts. Though small, it packs a punch. This town has captured the nation's attention more than once. Amelia Earhart, the first female pilot to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean, was born here. One of the largest bank heists in history also took place in Medford, when 5 men, including 3 former police officers, broke into a neighboring office and drilled a hole through a thick concrete wall. They then bored through 50 centimeters of concrete to reach the bank's vault. The robbers opened over 700 safety deposit boxes and stole $100 million in cash, gold, silver, and other valuables. Medford was also home to a regular family-owned restaurant, Bickford's, serving traditional American breakfasts, lunches, and dinners, a place where co-workers became enemies, where friendly smiles and sympathy turned into harassment, vandalism, assault, and ultimately led to one of the most notorious cases in Massachusetts history. Sandra, or Sandy Burfield, was in her early 20s when she moved to Everett, Massachusetts in 1988 to be closer to her sister, Sheila. She got a job as a waitress at Bickford's restaurant in Medford. Sandy was quickly hired because she was a very beautiful young woman with almond-shaped eyes and a thick mane of hair. She also had a knack for making friends easily. In the restaurant business, being outgoing and friendly is incredibly important, and the manager was very pleased with her. Apart from the occasional tardiness, there were no complaints about her work. She was sociable, great at connecting with people, and an incredibly kind person. Sometimes a homeless man would come into the restaurant and Sandy would feed him steak and breakfast from her own tips. She knew all too well that not everyone had it easy in life. At 16, she gave birth to a little girl named Diane, who was born with spina bifida. Sandy desperately wanted to spend all her free time with her daughter, but she needed to work, and Diane required constant care. Sandy had to place her daughter in a specialized clinic, but visited her whenever she could. Among Sandy's colleagues was Stephen Caruso. Stephen was studying photography, had a passion for computers, and had been a regular at the restaurant for 6 years, sometimes visiting a couple of times a day. He enjoyed the good food and casual chats with the staff. In 1993, the restaurant manager hired Steve as a handyman. He was highly skilled with his hands and excelled in various repair tasks, electrical work, plumbing, carpentry. Steve could do it all, but as talented as he was with his hands, he was equally strange in his interactions with others. Meanwhile, to save up for a car and visit her daughter more often, Sandy took a second job at a bar. She worked twice as much, but enjoyed both jobs, and now she had 2 sources of income. The bar became her second home. Sandy often spent time there even when she wasn't working. Tony Markin, a longtime friend, also liked to visit the bar. For many years, Sandy and Tony had been close friends, and after 8 years of knowing each other, they finally started dating. It happened naturally, as if they had always been meant to be together. Sandy's co-workers from the restaurant also liked to stop by the bar after work to have a drink. It was a great time for everyone, except for one dark cloud, Steve's behavior. He always came alone and acted inappropriately with the women, staring at them with a creepy, unsettling gaze. At the restaurant, Steve had his favorite waitresses. People joked that he changed them like gloves. He would specifically come in during their shifts and sit only at tables they were serving. The waitresses knew he was a bit odd but tolerated it. In 1996, it was Sandy's turn to become his favorite. Up until August 1998, their interactions were unremarkable. Sandy considered their relationship casual, almost friendly. In August 1997, Sandy's daughter Diane passed away, a devastating tragedy for her mother. After the loss, Sandy tried to be even kinder to everyone and didn't look down on people who behaved strangely. She became more patient, forgiving, and motherly, showing unconditional love to all. She also extended this friendly compassion to Steve. It's possible that Steve misinterpreted Sandy's vulnerability after her daughter's death and her friendliness toward him. He hovered around her, no matter what she was doing. While having a regular customer in the restaurant is generally a good thing, Steve became a distraction for Sandy when she was trying to take other customers' orders. In short, he paid too much attention to Sandy and was overly intrusive, which turned into a problem. At the end of August 1998, Steve began taking more assertive actions, inviting Sandy to see a movie at the theater. She politely declined the offer, but Steve didn't stop trying to impress her. He even went as far as washing Sandy's car without her permission. He continued to sit in his usual spot, watching Sandy without taking his eyes off her, smirking the entire time. Even Sandy's patience eventually ran out, and she started trying to minimize her interactions with him. After her repeated requests, the restaurant manager asked Steve to sit at a table in a different section of the restaurant. On August 24, 1998, Sandy was spending time at the home of one of her older sisters. Somehow, Steven found out she would be there and showed up uninvited. Without opening the door, Sandy told Steve to leave. She was home alone and became very frightened. Around that time, Sandy started keeping a journal, documenting all the strange incidents involving Steve. It seemed she had a bad feeling about the situation and wanted to leave a record of his persistent and unsettling behavior. Sandy decided not to let things slide and took the initiative. Among the restaurant's regulars was a police officer, and Sandy asked him to have a word with Steven. In the middle of the day, in front of all the customers, the officer approached Steven and demanded that he stop bothering Sandy. Steven felt humiliated. He rushed to the restaurant manager and threatened to file a lawsuit for discrimination. He also demanded a meeting with Sandy outside of the restaurant. Steven even called the headquarters of the company that owned the restaurant, claiming that his conversation with the police officer had been insulting and demanded that Sandy be fired. He went on to say that Sandy was mentally unstable and offered to pay for her psychiatric treatment. However, the headquarters repeated that he was not allowed to sit at her table and Sandy would no longer serve him. At that point, it seemed like Steven should have let the situation go and started eating at a different restaurant. Even in a small town, there were plenty of other options. But no, he continued to frequent the same restaurant, sitting in the same dining area, though not at Sandy's table. The way the restaurant was set up, though, allowed him to see her no matter where he sat, even though there were 3 separate dining areas. So even sitting in a different section, Steven's eyes still followed Sandy, and his face burned with anger. Thus began an open hostility between the 2 colleagues. Sandy asked the restaurant to ban him from the premises. However, Steven threatened to sue if they did, and the lawyers confirmed that he had the right to stay. Refusing him service would be illegal. This tense situation could have dragged on even longer, but at the end of September, Steven truly crossed the line for the first time. He turned to vandalism. On the night of September 27, 1998, someone slashed all the tires on Sandy's car. There were no witnesses to the incident, and although Sandy suspected Steve, she had no proof. Theoretically, it could also have been her boyfriend, with whom she had temporarily broken up. But on the night of September 30th, 1998, just before dawn, while Sandy was lying on the couch at home, she heard someone trying to puncture her tires again. She looked out the window of her second-floor apartment. She noticed someone walking away from her car. He was dressed all in black and wearing a hood, so she couldn't see his face. But she recognized Steve by his distinctive walk. The man seemed to slightly hop when walking, while swinging his left arm forward and backward. She reported the incident to the police and said she suspected Steve. Fearing further acts of vandalism, Sandy installed a surveillance camera that constantly filmed the street below. On October 4th, 1998, when she was about to leave for work, her car started acting up. The repairman discovered that someone had poured battery acid, electrolyte, into the fuel tank. When she returned home, Sandy watched the footage from the camera. The video clearly showed the vandal approaching her car at 3:15 a.m. Once again, Sandy recognized Steve by his distinctive walk, though. Like last time, he was dressed in black and wearing a hood. On October 25, 1998, around 2:15 a.m., someone once again poured the same liquid into Sandy's car's fuel tank. She was at home watching the act of vandalism on the monitor connected to the camera. First, a red car passed by her house. It was only partially visible, but Sandy knew Steve drove a similar car. 4 minutes later, from the direction where the red car had gone, a man in black clothing and a hood approached. His face was not visible, He was carrying something in his hand. The vandal approached Sandy's car, did something to the fuel tank, and returned in the same direction he had come from. At that moment, Sandy was calling 911. During the call, she ran downstairs to the first floor, from where she could observe the scene from a window in the hallway. As the man was leaving, he slightly turned his head for just a moment, but it was enough. She unmistakably identified Steve as the vandal. However, unfortunately at that time, acts like this did not result in an arrest. Sandy realized that she needed the help of law enforcement and sought a restraining order to prevent Steven from coming near her or her car. However, at that time, the law did not allow for action against a stalker unless the victim was in a relationship with them. If Sandy and Steve had been dating and then he started damaging her car, that would have been a different case. But since there had been no relationship between Sandy and Steve, except for possibly work-related interactions, Steve also worked part-time at the restaurant as a handyman, he could only face administrative consequences. That was the extent of what the law could offer her at the time. Sandy persisted and managed to get the restraining order. It prohibited Steven from coming within 90 meters. The order also barred him from visiting her workplace, resulting in him losing his job at the restaurant. Sandy believed the law would protect her, but instead it only infuriated Steven even more. He somehow convinced himself that Sandy was mocking him, which drove him into a rage. Steven paid no attention to the legal restrictions, even when the court tightened the conditions of the restraining order, extending the distance he had to maintain from her apartment to 450 meters. Thanks to video footage, he was charged with 3 counts of criminal property damage, though the police couldn't prove that Steven had slashed her tires the first time. Until his trial in January 1999, Steven was released on bail. However, a couple of months later, he was seen driving back and forth around the restaurant while Sandy was working. His bail was revoked, and he was returned to jail until the trial. The court found Steven guilty of criminal property damage. He was sentenced to 6 months in prison and an additional year of probation. He was required to undergo a psychiatric evaluation, stay away from Sandy and the restaurant, and pay $3,000 in restitution. Steven's conviction was a huge relief for Sandy. She never complained, but it was clear that she could breathe easier and no longer felt the need to constantly look over her shoulder. However, as the day of his release approached, she became anxious and tense once again. Steven was released on July 29, 1999. After his release, Sandy's boyfriend, Tony Marson, with whom she had resumed dating, gave her a folding knife for self-defense. She slept with the knife under her pillow and always kept it with her. After a while, she wrote in her diary, "A car stopped near the cafe. The driver looked inside. I saw it was Steven. The stalker had returned. He knew the distance he needed to keep from Sandy so that she couldn't do anything about it. He often stood across the street, watching her through the window. He was out there when she left work. He appeared out of nowhere, tormenting her with phone calls. He would call and breathe heavily into the receiver. Since, according to the caller ID, Steve was calling from a payphone, it was impossible to prove it was him, but no one else had any reason to do such a thing. Sandy felt like everything had started all over again. Her boyfriend Tony was getting fed up and was planning to confront Steven. However, Sandy forbade him from intervening. She said, "If you touch him, I won't speak to you for the rest of my days." It should be noted that Sandy had many relatives and friends who were ready to stand up for her at any moment. She was the youngest of 15 children. She had 9 sisters and 5 brothers. Moreover, the employees of the restaurant and bar where she worked treated her like family, a close friend. All she had to do was hint at it, and they would have talked to Steven immediately. But she firmly insisted that no one should intervene. Perhaps she was afraid that it would make things worse, like when she asked a police officer who frequented the restaurant to talk to Steven. Or she was worried that the vengeful stalker would redirect his hatred towards someone close to her. It's unknown. In any case, she not only did not ask for help, but demanded that no one interfere. In December 1999, another alarming incident occurred. Sandy was about to start her morning shift at the restaurant when she opened the door to the establishment and smelled a strong odor of gas. If she had gone into the kitchen and turned on the stoves as required during opening hours, the restaurant would have exploded. The year 2000 arrived. On January 20th, in the middle of the day, the landlady of the house where Sandy lived noticed a package addressed to Sandy while picking up the mail. She read the sender's name and address. The package had come from Malden, from Lois, Sandy's older sister. The landlady took the mail and went back to her apartment, and just a few minutes later, she and her husband heard Sandy come down to the first floor, collect the package, and head back upstairs. Most likely, during his 6 months of imprisonment, Stephen had reached the limit of his rage. After his release, he was planning to take revenge. He had enough time to plan the attack. From a friend, he learned how to make a bomb, but assembling it was only half the job. He had to somehow get Sandy to open it. After the gas incident at the restaurant, she had become even more cautious than before. He needed to come up with something that wouldn't raise her suspicions. On his computer, Stephen installed a genealogy tree creation program to learn everything he could about Sandy. He discovered names, birth dates, workplaces, spouses, and children's names of all her relatives. In particular, he found the name of Lois's husband, who lived in Malden, a different town in Massachusetts. In fact, the family hadn't lived there for a long time, but their address hadn't been updated in the program. Stephen assembled the bomb from a pipe fitting, loaded it with gunpowder and shrapnel, and placed it in a box. It was designed to explode as soon as Sandy opened it. He wrote down the recipients' and senders' addresses, and on Thursday, January 20th, 2000, at 9:30 in the morning, he drove to Sandy's house. The man calmly approached, left the package on the doorstep of the apartment building, and likely stayed nearby. He could hardly resist the pleasure of seeing his victim take the package. Sandy would never have brought it into the house if the sender hadn't been her older sister, Lois. Sandy read the name on the package and probably didn't read any further. She allowed herself to relax, entered her apartment, and opened the box. The next thing Sandy's neighbors remember is that the house shook from the explosion and a terrible noise. They rushed upstairs. When they opened the girl's door, a foul odor hit them, and their eyes watered from the smoke. Sandy lay on the floor. They immediately contacted emergency services. The arriving police unmistakably recognized the smell of gunpowder. Cautiously, so as not to spoil the evidence, an officer opened the door. Blood and body parts covered the floor, walls, and even the ceiling of the apartment. Sandy lay at the end of the hallway, hoping that the girl might still be alive. The officer called her name, but she did not respond. Sandra Burfield was dead at the age of 32. Most likely, Stephen was the last person to see his victim alive. Her loved ones and friends tried to find solace in the fact that she probably didn't realize what had happened. When Sandy's boyfriend Tony was called to be informed of the news, his sister answered the phone. She screamed hysterically, her legs giving way beneath her. She could only utter, "He got to her." No one doubted for a second who the killer was. Just 40 minutes after the explosion, the police were on their way to the suspect's house. When they arrived, they were struck by the fact that there was a huge photograph of Sandy hanging in every room. The man was interrogated, and his alibi kept changing. At first, he said he was at the library in the morning, then that he went to a cafe. Later, he reversed his story, saying he was first at the cafe and then at the library. However, when the detectives obtained a search warrant, they found everything necessary to make an explosive device. According to experts, it was the perfect homemade bomb. It worked exactly as the bomber intended. In cases of pipe bombs, it's common for the energy not to explode in the desired direction, meaning the victim might survive and even fully recover. Unfortunately, Steve turned out to be quite the handyman. After the police searched the man's house, Stephen's sister found a booklet on explosives and handed it over to the police. After Stephen's arrest, he was placed in a cell with another detainee, Michael Dubas. Michael recognized Steve because he had seen his photo in the news. He tried to ingratiate himself with the man. After an hour and a half of conversation, Michael learned everything he wanted to know. Steve made many incriminating statements, including things Michael couldn't have known from any other source. He described the actions of the bomb he had made, confessed to vandalizing Sandy's car, and mentioned that she had a recording of him doing it. He even explained how he found Sandy's sister's address to deceive her. The motive? He was angry with the girl for not wanting to date him. He referred to her with insulting words, and any previous adoration had completely vanished. Of course, Michael relayed all the details of the conversation to the police. The court hearing began with horrific details of the murder. Not a muscle in Steve's face twitched as everyone listened to what the bomb had done to the girl's body. The prosecution had enough evidence against him. Even the fact that he provided an incorrect address for Lois on the package worked in favor of the prosecution, as this incorrect address was successfully linked to the man's computer data. Stephen had perfectly chosen whose name to send the package from. Sandy's older sister Lois was collecting small plush toys at that time. The last in the series was about to be released. Sandy also liked it a lot, and Lois had promised to give her such a toy. The family believes Sandy thought it was that toy in the box, which is why she boldly brought it into the house, expecting a pleasant surprise from her sister that would lift her spirits. In August 2003, the 44-year-old man was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison, and the appeal was denied. Sandy's family could not allow such a nightmare to happen to anyone else. They were shocked that the law would have better protected Sandy if the victim and her stalker had been in a relationship. Sandy's brother managed to meet with former Senator Pamela Reeser. She helped change the law to correct this oversight. A separate legislative act was introduced focusing on protective orders. It now considers stalking a crime rather than a misdemeanor. The law was passed in 2010 and was named the Sandy Law. Now victims have the opportunity to obtain a protective order that involves criminal liability for the stalker. Even if there was no relationship between the victim and the stalker, Sandy BURFIELD spent her life helping people, and this law, named in her honor, will now assist other victims of stalking. Ildiko had everything: her own thriving business and a loving family, always ready to help and support her, living with her in a spacious, modern home in California. She worked hard to achieve all of this. From a very young age, she toiled relentlessly, constantly learning and improving herself. But everything changed in an instant when she was caught off guard, leaving her with only a few seconds of life. Ildiko Krajniak was born on June 8, 1969, in Miskolci, Hungary, the country's fourth largest city, located less than 200 kilometers from Budapest. Ildiko's mother worked in the beauty industry, and her daughter followed in her footsteps, obtaining an education as a cosmetologist. She wasn't even 20 years old, but she was confidently moving toward success. She knew all the intricacies of the business and understood that she needed to continuously learn new things to stay in demand. Clients greatly appreciated Ildiko as a cosmetologist, and she was confident she would never be out of work. That's why, in 1992, the 23-year-old took a big risk and, with just one suitcase and $50 in her pocket, flew to the U.S., landing in sunny California. It was difficult to leave behind her loved ones, friends, and hometown and move to a different country with different people, a different language, and culture. However, she didn't have time to dwell on melancholy. She needed to find a job and get licensed to work as a cosmetologist in California. It didn't take long before Ildiko became the top cosmetologist at the luxury Marriott Hotel Spa. She knew she could rely only on herself and worked hard to ensure her clients would return. A huge role in her success was played by her social circle, but for the friendly, charismatic, and welcoming Ildiko, making connections was not difficult. These and many other qualities attracted her future husband, Ranilo Vestil, who was a couple of years older than her. They married in 1996, and in 1998, the couple welcomed their son, Keanu. Both parents adored each other and their son, and they were willing to do anything for him. Professionally, Ildiko continued to thrive, and in 2002, she opened her own salon, which she named simply Hungarian Cosmetics. Years went by, her son went to college, and Ildiko's mother also moved to the U.S. Unfortunately, her mother developed dementia, but Ranilo took full responsibility for caring for his mother-in-law when Ildiko had to work or needed rest. Specifically, when Ildiko traveled to Hungary on May 5, 2018, to bring new cutting-edge equipment for her spa salon back to California. She returned a week later, eagerly anticipating the chance to try out the new equipment and return to her beloved work. But her plans were not meant to come true. On May 15, 2018, just after 1 p.m., a flood of calls overwhelmed emergency services, reporting a possible fire or explosion in the building where Ildiko's salon was located. Emergency responders arrived very quickly, but the building was already seriously engulfed in flames. Firefighters rushed to evacuate people not only from the burning building, but also from neighboring ones, including a daycare across the street. More than 100 children were led to safety. Many people had already run out of nearby buildings, filming videos and taking photos even before the emergency services arrived. However, no one knew exactly what had happened. Everyone had heard the explosion, after which debris from the building scattered across the area, and thick smoke filled the air. Some thought they had heard fireworks. Others suspected a pipe burst, a gas leak, or even an earthquake. But the force of the explosion shook the neighborhood. The part of the building where Ildiko worked was completely obliterated. Shards of glass littered the ground, car alarms blared, and smoke poured out. Firefighters, police, ambulances, and even the bomb squad arrived, as no one knew what else to expect. Of course, journalists also rushed to the scene. The once quiet neighborhood was now consumed by chaos. People were terrified. unable to determine the cause of the incident. What if there was another explosion? As journalists reported on the incident but still didn't know what had caused the fire, friends and family desperately tried to contact those who had been working or had planned to visit the building that day. Naturally, everyone was messaging and calling Ildiko, but she wasn't responding. Overcome with uncertainty, Ildiko's husband, Ranilo, rushed to her salon to find out if she had been at work. However, the officers on the scene still couldn't provide him with any information. Meanwhile, it was becoming clear that there were casualties. One person had inhaled smoke, and two other women, a mother and daughter, had managed to escape through a large hole in the brick wall, despite suffering severe burns. Both women were covered in blood and ash. Shards of glass were stuck to their hair and bodies, and their skin was peeling off in patches. They were rushed to the hospital, where they received medical treatment and underwent surgery. No one knew if there were more people inside the building or what injuries they might have sustained. But when emergency personnel got closer, it became clear that at least one person had not survived. They found body parts scattered in different directions, some even landing in the parking lot. Identifying the victim at that point was impossible. Investigators determined that there had been an explosion, with the epicenter located at the reception desk of Ildiko Spa. Despite the massive damage, the police and FBI quickly ruled out any ongoing threat to the public. However, swift action was necessary because a dangerous bomber, ready to kill, was still at large. The mother and daughter, whose names have not been disclosed, were in Ildiko's salon during the incident and later shared what they witnessed. Ildiko had just returned from Hungary. Although she had assistants, the salon had been closed during her absence. At that moment, there was no one else in the salon besides the two women. Both were regular clients. After their cosmetic treatments, the mother went to the front desk to pay, while her daughter went to get a drink. The older woman recalled how Ildiko picked up a cardboard box that had been lying near other boxes and mail. The box was rectangular, like a shoebox, but not very wide. Ildiko placed the box on the desk and began to open it. The next thing the woman remembered was a bright, searing flash of light when Ildiko opened the package, followed by a loud noise and a wave of heat. She was thrown to the floor with force. There was the sound of shattering glass. The salon plunged into darkness, and the air was filled with smoke and dust. The daughter had to literally dig her mother out from under the debris to lead her to safety through the hole in the wall. Unfortunately, due to a shard of glass, the older woman lost one of her eyes. However, they were grateful to have survived and made it outside. They didn't see Ildiko again. The police determined that the package had not been delivered through the mail, as it would have been traceable. However, they still didn't know who had created the device or what chemicals and detonators had been used. The next step was to collect all the evidence that could be relevant and send it to the Quantico lab in Virginia for analysis. Unfortunately, the police soon confirmed that the only person killed in the explosion was Ildiko. Investigators quickly moved to speak with her family and friends, and they uncovered something unexpected. Despite the fact that Ildiko and Ranilo seemed to care deeply for each other, with Ranilo supporting his wife in every way and taking care of her sick mother, the couple had not actually been together for a long time. They were still legally married, but Ildiko had been seeing other men for years, which Ranilo was aware of. Ildiko didn't like to talk much about how she and her husband had reached this arrangement, but she often shared stories about her romantic affairs. Her friends knew that over the last several years, she had dated at least 5 or 6 men. This was important for the investigation because one of these individuals could potentially be the bomber. In fact, Ildiko had recently started seeing a new man who lived in Sacramento. Investigators began to wonder, could it be that Ranilo hadn't actually accepted the situation in their family and was jealous of her lovers? As a result, they conducted a search of his home. Officers examined every detail of the house, seized all the gadgets, and took away several bags of items to be studied in the lab. However, none of the evidence or Ranilo's behavior suggested that he was a vengeful husband. He was genuinely devastated by the fact that the mother of his son, whom he had once loved and still respected and valued, had been killed in such a cruel way. The saddest part of all this was that Ildiko's son, who was studying in Washington, and her brother, who lived in Hungary, learned about what had happened not from their family, but from the news. This occurred because FBI agents had seized all the devices in the family's home during the search. Unable to reach his father or grandmother, nor the sheriff's office, Ildiko's son began calling local hospitals. When FBI agents finally told him that his mother had died, he was in shock. He couldn't believe it. Meanwhile, journalists were sensationalizing the details of the extensive search in the family's home. It was just awful and inhumane to treat the closest relatives of the deceased woman in this way, not allowing them to find out about her death from their loved ones. Now investigators had to establish who Ildiko had been in contact with and track her movements in the days leading up to her death. Essentially, they were searching for anyone who might have wanted to harm her. They reviewed surveillance footage from the airport where Ildiko's flight landed after she returned from Hungary. Could it be that she hadn't traveled alone? Indeed, she was seen talking to a man who likely wasn't traveling with her since he didn't have any luggage. Furthermore, Ildiko had a layover at the San Francisco airport, and in that footage, she was seen with another man. Now, investigators had images of two men, but they didn't know their names. They spoke with Ildiko's friends and also investigated her employees and colleagues, given that the explosion had occurred in her salon. During the inquiry, someone unexpectedly mentioned that the co-owner of her spa, 59-year-old Stephen Beale, was a rocket enthusiast. He had been building and launching rockets in the desert for years, a hobby known to all his acquaintances. This caught the investigators' attention. However, Stephen was cooperative, open, and eager to assist with the investigation. He even allowed officers to search his home and garage. Indeed, they found completed rockets and chemical substances used for making them. Of course, detectives were particularly interested in the rockets Stephen had built and his overall knowledge of explosives. He explained that while he loved rockets, he had never made bombs, as that would require more advanced knowledge and different materials than what he had at home. He mentioned that he had once been into fireworks, but stopped after the September 11th attacks. Investigators were also curious about how he became involved in the spa business without being a cosmetologist. Stephen shared that he and Ildiko had met and become friends in 2016. Before meeting her, Stephen had been a widower for several years. His wife, with whom he had been married for 29 years, died of pancreatitis in 2008. So there was nothing stopping their friendship from evolving into a romantic relationship. According to Stephen, he and Ildiko dated for about a year, and he was happy to help his girlfriend open a spa. Before breaking up, they had taken a trip to Portugal, where Stephen noticed changes in her behavior. She changed the passwords on her phone and was actively texting someone. When Stephen asked her to explain, Ildiko told him that she wanted to date other men. Stephen wasn't happy to hear this, but he understood her decision. He too had begun dating another woman named Valerie. Despite this, Stephen and Ildiko remained not only business partners, but also friends. Meanwhile, investigators continued to examine the victim's life and discovered that Ildiko had been seeing not only Stephen and the man from Sacramento. A witness who visited the spa on the morning of the explosion saw a tall, gray-haired man leaving Ildiko's office. The police identified him as Scott Mullally. He was supposed to have lunch with Ildiko on the day of the explosion and had also picked her up at the airport in Los Angeles after her flight from San Francisco. The man reported that they had spent the night together, but he didn't know Ildiko very well. They had only met a couple of weeks prior at a casino. He didn't seem to have a motive for the murder, but he was still questioned, and a search warrant was obtained for his property. Additionally, the police located another man from the San Francisco airport named Laszlo Robo. He had traveled to Hungary with her, and before that trip, they had been seeing each other occasionally. He lived in Sacramento and was able to prove that he wasn't even close to the spa on the day of the explosion. Thus, the police eliminated the men Ildiko had been involved with, one after another. These leads, however, did not lead anywhere. At the FBI laboratory in Quantico, specialists examined over 300 pieces and fragments of items found at the explosion site. They discovered the outer casing of a 9-volt battery. Only this outer shell remained. The inner part had been completely destroyed. This meant that inside the cardboard box Ildiko had opened was a mechanism that had activated upon opening the box, powered by this very battery. It was clear that a person with no interest in such mechanisms would not be able to create something like this. While the components of the device could be purchased at any hardware or construction store, one would need to know how to connect all these parts into a single lethal mechanism that would activate precisely when needed by the bomber. Ranillo, Stephen, and other friends of Ildiko claimed there was only one person who hated the woman so intensely. This person was not a man, but there was a man involved. In 2015, Ildiko had an affair with a man named Gabor Pol. Gabor's wife, Elizabeth, suspected something was amiss and followed her husband. She caught the lovers in the act at Ildiko's salon. Naturally, it resulted in an unpleasant scene, and Gabor promised to end the affair. However, when tensions seemed to have settled, Ildiko reconnected with Gabor in 2017. Elizabeth decided to take more active measures. She contacted both Ildiko and Ranillo, sending Ildiko explicit photos of herself with Gabor and demanding that Ranillo keep a closer watch on his wife. Of course, she was unaware of the agreement between Ranillo and Ildiko. Clearly, Ildiko was not backing down, and in April 2018, just a month before the explosion, Elizabeth once again reached out to Ranillo, asking him to influence his wife. Ranillo simply suggested that Elizabeth block her rival. Ildiko was determined to continue her affair, and as inhumane as it sounded, the explosion worked in Elizabeth's favor. However, when Elizabeth and Gabor were brought in for questioning, the woman confessed to investigators that she hated her rival, but the couple allowed the police to search their home and examine their phones. This turned out to be a promising but ultimately false lead. While Elizabeth had a motive, she lacked the means or knowledge to create a bomb. No matter how you look at it, the police had only one person in mind who possessed the knowledge necessary to create an explosive device: Stephen Beale. The detectives then examined his past. They wanted to understand whether he had a motive or if he could be definitively ruled out from the list of suspects. Stephen had previously worked as a consultant on administrative matters, but had long been receiving disability benefits due to lead poisoning, which resulted in the development of aphasia. This condition causes a person to lose the ability to speak or comprehend speech, and in some cases to count, read, or write. Nevertheless, Stephen had tried his hand at acting and successfully performed in several productions. That is, he couldn't work, but could act. Moreover, when Stephen met Ildiko several years ago, he had already been a widower for 8 years. His wife, Christine, had died of pancreatitis, right? Not quite. In February 2008, the couple was moving furniture, and while lowering a heavy table down the stairs, Christine fell. Not only was she crushed by the weight of the table at the bottom of the stairs, but Stephen also fell on top of her. The woman was taken to the hospital with injuries to her hip and pelvis. For the next few weeks, she was alternately discharged from the hospital and then returned due to complications. When she died, Stephen was devastated, but this did not prevent him from refusing to help the doctors, for example, by sharing information about his wife's medical history. Moreover, he did not immediately inform the police that he had been home when his wife fell. Christine herself told everyone that it was an accident. However, an inexplicably high concentration of lead was found in her body, and the pathologist could not make a definitive conclusion about the cause of her death. Stephen later claimed that the previous owner of their house made fishing lures and used lead. Allegedly, Stephen himself was also exposed to lead, resulting in the development of aphasia. But the police discovered that 6 months before his wife's death, Stephen bought lead tetroxide, and 6 weeks before Christine's death, he insured his wife. Due to this, the insurance company refused to pay him the insurance. However, Stephen sued and in 2010 received $550,000. While the investigators were looking into Stephen's past, they were also checking local stores where everything necessary for the explosive device could be purchased. They knew which chain of stores, CVS, sold 9-volt batteries. They discovered that Stephen had withdrawn cash a week before the explosion from an ATM near one of the stores in this chain. When they reviewed the surveillance cameras, they saw Stephen enter the store on May 8th and buy just such a battery. He paid in cash. Then he went into the neighboring store and bought a cardboard box, the same size as the box in which the bomb was found. It couldn't have been a coincidence. Finally, although the surveillance cameras at Ildiko Spa were not working, the officers reviewed the footage from the cameras near the spa and saw that on May 11th, a car resembling Stephen's Prius had stopped in the parking lot a block away from the spa. However, for the prosecution and the court, this was not enough. Therefore, the detectives turned to the woman Stephen had been dating after Ildiko, Valerie. Stephen had proposed to her, and now she was his fiancée. Of course, Valerie initially didn't want to think that her fiancé was a murderer. But if Stephen were to confess to someone about the crime, it would only be to her. So the detectives showed her all the evidence against Stephen and pressed her on her feelings, repeating that Ildiko's family needed to know why she had died. To some extent, Valerie herself needed to know if her fiancé could be a murderer. In the end, she agreed. She and Stephen went to Malibu for the weekend. The FBI agents agreed to pay for their stay in Malibu in exchange for planting several microphones on Valerie and in the car. But their plan didn't pay off. Valerie tried several times to bring up Ildiko and her terrible murder, but Stephen didn't say anything suspicious. Ultimately, this only convinced Valerie that her fiancé had nothing to do with the crime. The police did not hope to find any additional evidence and decided to take a risk. On March 3, 2019, a month before the first anniversary of the explosion, Stephen was arrested. He was charged with the destruction of a building resulting in death. In other words, he was accused of manufacturing the explosive device that destroyed the building and killed Ildiko. This was a federal charge. He faced the death penalty or life imprisonment. The possibility of parole was not considered in a federal case. In addition to the main charge of murdering Ildiko, other charges were added, particularly insurance fraud. The man should have reported receiving $350,000 in insurance when he filed for bankruptcy, but he did not do so. His house and car were searched again, and traces of chemicals similar to those found at the crime scene were discovered in the Prius. This was logical, as Stephen would have transported the bomb in his car. In June 2020, the prosecutor announced that they would not seek the death penalty for Stephen. The trial began in June 2022. However, on August 22nd, the jury could not reach a unanimous decision. 9 jurors found the defendant guilty, but 3 were not convinced that it was indeed Stephen Bill who killed Ildiko. The prosecution did not back down. A second trial began on June 29, 2023. Lacking additional evidence, the prosecutors emphasized the brutality of the explosion and Ildiko's murder. They showed the jury a reconstruction video and used a mannequin to visually demonstrate how horrific the explosion was. When the device went off, the mannequin was blown to pieces. The jury was impressed. On July 19, Stephen was found guilty. He filed an appeal, continuing to insist on his innocence. Prosecutors believe everything began with a trip to Portugal in March 2018, just 2 months before the explosion. That is, Ildiko and Stephen were not seeing each other long ago, as the man claimed, but shortly before her murder. He knew she was married, but thought that apart from that, she wasn't dating anyone else. In Portugal, Stephen unexpectedly discovered that his girlfriend was corresponding with someone in Hungarian. In fact, she had been in touch with Laszlo, the man who had been with her at the San Francisco airport. Stephen took a screenshot of their correspondence to translate it later. That's how he found out that Ildiko was unfaithful to him. The offended boyfriend pretended to understand and accept Ildiko's position. He also started dating another woman, pretending that it was a long time ago and that it was just old news. But it was merely a public facade. Although he and Ildiko continued seeing each other behind Valerie's back, Stephen felt humiliated, insulted, and wanted Ildiko to pay for this. And when she went to Hungary for business, he calmly crafted an explosive device and brought it to the spa, not caring about how many more innocent victims could suffer in the explosion. He believed he had outsmarted everyone. The crime would have gone unpunished if he hadn't chosen a method of murder that pointed directly to him from the very beginning of the investigation.
(1990). 31-year-old Peggy Marshall was at the peak of her career. Armed with a degree in physical therapy, she founded a geriatric clinic in Newport Beach, California. Peggy was passionate about her work, enjoying helping her elderly patients, but what she truly longed for was love. Her dream came true that same year when she met 24-year-old volleyball player Eric Beckler. Peggy and Eric both loved sports, which became their shared passion. Just a few months after meeting, they became inseparable. They lived together in Peggy's apartment and worked together at her clinic. Eric handled the finances, while Peggy provided physical therapy services. Together they made a great team, and the business quickly grew, along with their bank account. Before this, Eric didn't have much of a career, but thanks to his girlfriend, his financial situation improved dramatically, and he enjoyed a stable and wonderful life in a great neighborhood. Soon after their magical wedding ceremony, Peggy Beckler learned that she was expecting a child. But the growing family didn't significantly change their lifestyle. The couple simply brought their daughter with them to the beach. Not long after their first child, a second arrived, and the family moved into a beautiful home they bought for $1 million. They hired 2 nannies, one for weekdays and one for weekends, especially since a third child had arrived. This was the big family Peggy had always dreamed of, like the one she grew up in herself. Thus, the 5th anniversary of the Becklers' marriage quietly arrived. On July 6, 1997, Gary Green, along with a large group of friends and family, was heading from Newport Beach to Catalina Island on his boat when he noticed a boat circling in the ocean. Nearby, a man on a surfboard was struggling in the water, calling for help. Gary Green threw him a life jacket to keep him from drowning and called the Coast Guard. When they arrived, they saw the boat displaying a phenomenon known as the Circle of Death. This happens when the person controlling the boat lets go of the steering mechanism while the engine is running and the propeller is still spinning. Ideally, the operator should be connected to a safety lanyard, which would immediately shut off the engine if they were thrown overboard. However, people often ignore this rule. So when the steering mechanism is released, the force of the spinning propeller creates torque, causing the boat to make sharp turns and continuously rotate in a circle. The Coast Guard was able to stop the boat. They also pulled the man from the water and brought him back to the harbor. He was freezing, panicked, and in tears. The man was Eric Beckler, and his wife, Peggy Beckler, had been on the boat with him. A rescue operation for Peggy immediately began. At that point, she had been in the water for less than 2 hours, and the Coast Guard was hopeful that the rescue would be successful. Peggy was an extraordinarily strong swimmer. At an early age, she was diagnosed with scoliosis and had to wear a back brace. She was only allowed to take it off while swimming, so she spent a lot of time in the water. Swimming became second nature to her. There was a very high chance that Peggy was at least keeping herself afloat while they searched for her. The key was to pinpoint her location as accurately as possible. To aid the rescue operation, the Coast Guard spoke with Eric. He was distraught, shaking, and crying, but he managed to explain that they had been celebrating Peggy's birthday and their 5th wedding anniversary that day. In the morning, he woke his wife up and announced that they were going to the beach. There, a surprise awaited her. Eric had rented a speedboat with a fairly powerful engine. However, it was easy to handle, even for beginners. The couple initially planned to swim in the harbor, but soon grew bolder and ventured farther into the ocean for some excitement. For a couple with no experience in ocean boating, renting a speedboat and heading out into the ocean was quite ambitious. But they were enjoying their time. They had a picnic, drank margaritas, and made love. Eventually, they decided to head back. Peggy was at the helm, while Eric wanted to take one more ride on a boogie board. This type of surfing involves catching a wave while lying on your stomach on a relatively small board. As they approached the harbor, they were hit by what's known as a rogue wave or a killer wave, which completely engulfed Eric. When he resurfaced, Peggy was no longer on the boat. The boat itself was circling, making it impossible to get close. He couldn't swim away either, as he was still hoping to see Peggy on the water's surface. The Coast Guard officers were slightly puzzled by the fact that the weather conditions that day were surprisingly favorable for a sea trip. There were no waves and only a light breeze. They mentioned this to Eric, but he stood by his story. The investigators didn't argue. Although there had been no reports of rogue waves, they could have gone unnoticed. The ocean is an unpredictable place. Even in calm weather, many factors, wind, currents, tides, can combine to form unexpected, sometimes deadly waves. Hours passed. Evening came, but the Coast Guard helicopters and boats continued to search for Peggy. Even Navy submarines joined the search efforts. As night fell, confidence in a successful rescue began to fade. If the current had carried her away, she could have ended up in Santa Barbara or even Mexico. Peggy Beckler was searched for relentlessly for several days, but in the end, the difficult decision was made to call off the search. The Coast Guard focused on examining the boat. First, they made sure there were no mechanical issues that could have caused the accident. Then, they tried to recreate the situation the couple had been in. All the experiments showed that no matter how the boat rocked, the person steering it should have fallen inside the boat, not into the water. There was another odd detail. A pair of sunglasses was found near the steering mechanism. If Peggy had been swept away by a wave, the glasses should have fallen overboard, along with other items which should have been in disarray, but nothing of the sort was observed. Suspicion grew, and the Coast Guard asked the Homicide Investigation Department to look into the case. It was only later that forensic experts examined the boat. However, since the Coast Guard initially treated the case as an accident, most of the evidence had been lost. Under the mattress, the investigators found a small stain that looked like blood. The amount was too small to extract DNA or even determine the blood type. They couldn't even confirm if it was human blood or from a fish. Nevertheless, this didn't stop the investigators from questioning Eric about the discovery. Eric explained that his wife was on her period, and since they had been intimate, something could have gotten on the mattress. A reasonable explanation, but the detectives weren't ready to take his word for it. The boat was treated with luminol to detect traces of blood, and they found a whole pool of blood that had been carefully cleaned. It was invisible to the naked eye. Unfortunately, too much time had passed, and it was now impossible to determine when the blood had appeared or who had cleaned it up. Besides, Eric seemed so distraught over his wife's disappearance. No one believed that he could have killed his beloved wife. Moreover, there was another theory regarding her disappearance. Peggy and Eric had been spending too much money. Eric hadn't made mortgage payments on their home for several months, and their financial situation had deteriorated. But at that moment, Peggy caught a lucky break. She was approached by representatives of another company interested in buying her clinic because it had achieved great success. Peggy was faced with a tough choice. She didn't want to sell her clinic for any amount of money, as it was her life's work. However, her husband felt differently. He wanted to get rid of all their problems and difficulties, take the money, and not work. After giving in to his persuasion, Peggy agreed to sell the business. But luckily for her, the new bosses wanted both her and her husband to stay and continue working at the clinic. This was a great solution for them, but the situation didn't last long. The new owners uncovered fraudulent schemes through which the clinic had been receiving money from insurance companies for services it hadn't provided. During the period in question, Eric had been handling the finances, but his wife, as the clinic owner, took the fall. The new owners found this unacceptable and fired both of them. But losing her job wasn't the worst part for Peggy. Her clinic had been draining money from medical insurance providers for years, and someone had to be held accountable. She was facing charges of fraud and tax evasion. These are federal charges, and theoretically she could have faced 10 to 15 years in prison. Peggy confessed all this to Eric's mother, Linda. This is why Linda was convinced that Peggy had staged her own disappearance. She believed that Peggy, being a strong swimmer, had jumped overboard, easily swum to shore, and then settled somewhere in Morocco or the Caribbean. Linda thought Peggy would only return once the statute of limitations on the federal charges expired. At first, Eric's actions seemed to confirm her suspicions. He recovered surprisingly quickly after his wife's disappearance. He then sent their 3 young children to live with Peggy's parents, giving them full custody. But if anyone thought that Eric would soon try to disappear and join Peggy, they were mistaken. Just 3 months after his wife's disappearance, Eric was already dating someone new. Her name was Tina New, a model and actress who appeared in TV shows. As Eric quickly ran out of money, he decided to become a web designer. To promote his company, he planned to participate in a professional expo. He needed a model to attract attention, and a photographer friend from his volleyball team recommended Tina, whom he knew. The two hit it off right away. When Tina met Eric, she was struggling with substance abuse. Her car was in the shop, her home had no electricity due to unpaid bills, and the job offer from Eric came at just the right time. In her eyes, he seemed like a hero, a successful young businessman, so polite and courteous. So when he invited her to come home with him that same evening, Tina agreed. Eric's home was luxurious, with ocean views from every window. Almost every wall in every room was covered with family photos, many of them featuring Peggy. Eric didn't hide what had happened to his wife from Tina. Overall, he seemed like a perfect prince to her. So when the police contacted her to inform her that there was something suspicious about his wife's disappearance and asked her to inform them if she learned anything, Tina didn't believe them. The detectives left her their card, confident that once the initial charm wore off, she would call them. And they were right. Eric's new business failed after just a year, and he was catastrophically short of money to maintain the lifestyle he was used to. He lost his home, and he and Tina moved into a modest apartment. He also tried playing the stock market, but things didn't go well for him there either. The creditors were calling non-stop. Their relationship deteriorated significantly. They fought, reconciled, and fought again. It was October 1999. More than 2 years had passed since Peggy's disappearance. Tina and Eric had a fight so loud that the neighbors called the police. When the officers arrived, Eric was not in the apartment, and Tina handed them the detective's business card, asking them to call him. She told the arriving detectives that when they last spoke, she and Eric had just started dating. She was in love with him and believed the story he had told her. But now, she was certain that Eric had killed his wife. Tina told the detectives that a few weeks earlier, she and Eric had been at home, and she was watching old television shows that featured her. While fast-forwarding through the commercials, she suddenly stopped on a segment that had somehow been recorded. It was a news segment about the disappearance of Peggy Beckler. The news report discussed the water current and the weather on that day, which was completely inconsistent with what Eric had told her. Tina looked at him and said, "You lied to me." The blood drained from his face. He turned pale. Eric admitted that he had seen his wife fall overboard but hadn't been able to swim to her in time. Tina asked if he couldn't or didn't want to. He replied, "I couldn't." Then he thoughtfully added, "Or maybe I didn't want to." A bad feeling began to creep over Tina, but she decided to brush the conversation aside. A couple of weeks later, Tina and Eric were relaxing at a club where they were using illegal substances. When they returned home, they were lying in bed, still not fully recovered, when Tina suddenly exclaimed, "Oh my God, you hit her in the head." She didn't even understand why she realized this so clearly. Eric even jumped. He asked, "How do you know that?" But she didn't know until he confirmed it with those words. Tina demanded to know how it all happened. It turned out that the day before the boating trip, Eric had prepared a cooler, dumbbells, trash bags, and everything needed for margaritas. Eric told Peggy that it was a surprise, so she didn't even look into the bag. They went out into the ocean. Peggy was just lying there, relaxing, sunbathing, when her husband approached her from behind and, according to him, hit her so hard that she didn't even feel it. Then the murderer folded his wife's body in half, tied her ankles, wrists, and neck together, put 2 trash bags on Peggy, and dumped her into the water with a weight of 30 kilograms. After that, he returned to the boat several kilometers closer to shore. This meant that the Coast Guard, helicopters, and submarines were all searching for Peggy in the wrong place. Tina told the police all of this, but her words weren't enough for even an arrest of Eric because she could simply be making false accusations against her ex-boyfriend. However, this wasn't the first time detectives had heard similar allegations against Eric. They had heard the same from his best friend, Kobe Laker. A few months after the boating incident, Eric's friend, Kobe Laker, went to the police with a lawyer. Kobe had already been questioned before, but now he confessed that he had lied when he told the police that the couple had a perfect relationship. Eric had repeatedly confessed to his friend that he was fed up with his wife and could no longer tolerate her. Eric considered his wife controlling and demanding. On the other hand, she was carrying the weight of the children and the business, while he just wanted to play volleyball with his friends. She brought money into the household, and he was happy to spend it. All of this Eric had shared with Kobe. One day, Eric directly asked his friend what he would think if Eric killed his wife. Allegedly, Eric was considering taking her out into the ocean and dumping her in the water in a barrel or something similar. When Kobe regained his speech, he asked if he was joking, and Eric replied, "Maybe." Kobe stated that he hadn't mentioned this before because he was scared and wanted to protect his friend. Thanks to the young man's testimony, the police officially classified the case as a homicide. But without physical evidence, including the victim's body, investigators couldn't proceed. They needed to get Eric to confess on tape. Kobe agreed to wear a recording device and meet with Eric, but he couldn't get his friend to open up. Eric remained calm and insisted that Peggy had indeed had an accident. The police had only Kobe's word against Eric's. That wasn't enough for an arrest. By the time Kobe testified, the police had long given up on the idea that Peggy had faked her disappearance to avoid fraud charges. In reality, she faced a maximum fine, not prison time, so it was unlikely she would have abandoned her beloved husband and children to hide in another country. Therefore, the police now suggested that Tina try to get Eric to talk so they could record his words and arrest him. She agreed because she was openly afraid of her boyfriend. On October 29, 1999, the police placed a listening device on the girl's back and another in her handbag. Tina and Eric met at a restaurant, with detectives positioned both inside the restaurant and outside in the parking lot. The girl was supposed to act confidently, but she was afraid that Eric would hug her and feel the device on her. Eric and Tina had a couple of cocktails, after which Tina got down to business. She told Eric that the police had come to her asking questions about Peggy's disappearance, so they needed to agree on how she would respond. The man simply replied that she hadn't been on the boat. That was all she needed to say. But that answer didn't satisfy Tina. She had always known that if anyone could get Eric to talk, it would be her. So she asked how it had come to this. Why didn't he just divorce his wife? Eric replied that he would lose money in a divorce and would never see his children again. His wife would take them away and wouldn't let him see them. But who was he fooling? Tina knew very well that as soon as Peggy disappeared, he had given custody of the children to her parents. Still, that was something. Tina continued to press. She asked how she could be sure he wouldn't do something similar to her if they continued to date, to which he replied that he would never do that again. This was not enough, but still sufficient for Eric's arrest. The detectives, of course, did not hear a confession from him because he demanded a lawyer. But when they searched him, they found a weight bench that was missing only the 15-kilogram weights. Together, they accounted for the 30 kilograms he had mentioned to Tina. The trial began. This was a unique case because the prosecution had no physical evidence of the man's crime or that Peggy was even dead. Moreover, Eric acted very cleverly, confirming that during his conversation with Tina, he meant the murder of his wife. However, he claimed that she liked bad boys and that he was trying to create that image. The prosecutor was well prepared and used all circumstantial evidence to convincingly demonstrate his version of the events of that day. Furthermore, the motive for the murder was indisputable and as old as time. Both spouses were insured for more than $2.5 million. Today, that would be the equivalent of nearly $4 million. This issue clearly concerned Eric because 3 months before Peggy's disappearance, he called her brother to inquire about the money. He wanted to know more about the policies and how the payout would work if something happened to his wife. Interestingly, a month and a half before her death, Peggy wanted to change the beneficiary of the insurance. She intended to exclude Eric so that the money would go only to the children. This indicates how little she trusted her husband in her final days. Of course, Eric did not receive the insurance payout anyway, because insurance companies are very reluctant to pay money to potential suspects. After 7 days of deliberation on February 1, 2001, Eric was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. After his wife's death, Eric did not receive the insurance money. Instead, he lost his home and income, and his new business failed. Indeed, Peggy was far more valuable to her husband alive. She was his ticket to a luxurious life, and even in the case of a divorce, he would have gained more than nothing. But evidently, he did not understand that. Not to mention the fact that murder itself is a terrible crime. Overall, he did not act very sensibly. No wonder his volleyball buddy said he must have had an accomplice because he was too foolish to come up with everything on his own. Not to mention that the police had no evidence, but his long tongue led to him spending the rest of his life in prison instead of playing volleyball on the beach. On a beautiful autumn morning on October 22, 1993, Doug Boggs entered his hardware store in the resort town of Steamboat Springs, Colorado. The store had been in operation for 63 years, a family business that Doug ran with his brother, Gerald or Jerry Boggs. However, that morning, Jerry did not show up for work. This was entirely uncharacteristic of him. Jerry was a creature of habit and adhered to a strict daily routine. Doug became so worried that he went to his brother's home. The front door was locked, so Doug went around to the back door leading into the kitchen. As soon as he opened the door, he saw his brother. Jerry was lying on the floor with blood pooled around his head. It was a horrifying scene that shocked Doug to the core. He immediately called emergency services. The police officers who arrived at the scene based on the man's wounds speculated that he had been beaten with a heavy object and had also sustained 3 gunshot wounds. Now, the investigators had to determine how such a tragedy could happen to one of the most respected and beloved citizens of Steamboat Springs. 52-year-old Jerry Boggs had lived in Steamboat Springs for most of his life. He had only left the town for his studies at the University of Colorado and during his time in the Vietnam War. After returning from Vietnam, he resumed working in the family business, and now he and his brother managed the store together. Jerry handled the paperwork and supply orders while Doug interacted with the customers. Jerry was a fairly strong-willed person, but he was also kind, modest, and a loyal friend. By the age of 52, he had grown accustomed to his established bachelor lifestyle. However, everything changed one fine day when a charming 48-year-old woman walked into his store. She introduced herself as Jill Coit. Jill stood out from the other women in town, even from the tourists. She dressed stylishly and somewhat provocatively, but never vulgarly. She was sociable, cheerful, and spoke with a delightful Southern accent. Jill mentioned that she had moved from Culver, Indiana, having bought a small hotel in Steamboat Springs. Since she was fixing up the hotel with her sons, she often appeared in Jerry's store for supplies. Soon, Jerry gathered the courage to make the first move. He asked her out on a date. From that moment on, their romantic relationship began. Just 7 months after meeting, Jerry and Jill got married. This was an unusually spontaneous decision for Jerry, but he had a reason. His beloved was expecting a baby. Jerry had a successful business, family, friends, money, and now his beloved wife was going to give him a child. Jerry was over the moon with happiness. He took the news with full responsibility. He remodeled the house for the baby, bought children's furniture, and read books on parenting. However, his happiness came to an abrupt end as secrets about his wife began to surface one after another. Months went by, yet there were no physical changes in Jill's appearance. By this time, her pregnancy should have been quite visible. Suddenly, Jill went to Texas, and when she returned, she claimed to have given birth to a baby girl named Laura. By then, Jerry's family and friends were not merely suspicious. They outright declared that it was some kind of scam and that he should stay away from her and get a divorce, especially since she forgot to inform him that she was already married at the time they got married. Jerry was devastated, confused as to why she would do this to him, but he knew for certain that the marriage needed to be annulled, as his nature abhorred living in an illegal union. There was also an intriguing financial situation. Jill had convinced Jerry to sign a document stating that he had supposedly lent her $100,000. In reality, he had not given her the money. She needed it to appear as though she owed him a large sum, so she wouldn't have to repay debts to creditors or share finances with her ex-husband. However, after their marriage was annulled and she moved out of his house, Jill sued him. She wanted to remove his name from the document and sell the hotel, which was worth $600,000. As Doug recounted, his brother was already angry about Jill's lies regarding her previous marriage and the fake pregnancy, and the lawsuit brought his indignation and resentment to a new level. Jerry filed a countersuit. He wanted her to stop tarnishing his name, admit there was no pregnancy, and compensate him for his losses. For 2 years, Jerry awaited the court date while he returned to his usual routine. But 6 days before the scheduled court date, his brother found him dead on the kitchen floor. The police carefully examined the crime scene, only to be met with enormous disappointment. There were no signs of forced entry, nothing had been stolen, and the killer had left no clues behind. The murderer took the firearm with them and left no fingerprints or blood on the shovel used to beat the victim. Whoever committed this heinous crime had covered their tracks exceptionally well. Neighbors did not hear any gunshots. However, one neighbor did recall something suspicious. On the day of the murder, she was outside and saw 2 people walking down the street. They looked suspicious enough that she went back inside. Despite the warm weather, they were dressed very warmly and resembled hunters. One was clearly a man, but she wasn't sure about the second person. There was definitely something off about them. At the same time, the medical examiner conducted an autopsy. He determined that the attack on Jerry Boggs had occurred in the afternoon of October 21st. He confirmed that Jerry had been shot 3 times, beaten, and an attempt had been made to strangle him. However, he was puzzled by marks on the right side of Jerry's neck and cheek. These were not the characteristic muzzle imprints of a point-blank gunshot wound. The medical examiner was unable to determine what had caused these mysterious marks. However, for Jerry's family, his murder was no mystery. Doug Boggs told the police that he knew exactly who was responsible. He pleaded with the police to question Jerry's ex-wife, Jill Coit. Doug's suspicions had been aroused 2 years earlier when Jill claimed she was pregnant. His brother was in love and believed everything Jill said. Concerned, Jerry's relatives contacted a friend who was a private detective and asked her to investigate Jill's background. What the detective uncovered was a completely different Jill than the one Jerry knew. With each new detail, the detective was more and more astounded. She even had difficulty determining Jill's birth year because Jill Coit had 4 birth certificates, 3 social security numbers, and at least 15 different identities she had used over the past 25, 30 years. By the time Jill met Jerry, he was potentially husband number 8. Jill Lanita Billiot was born in Louisiana. She had a tumultuous relationship with her brother, which led her to leave home at 15 and move in with her grandparents in Indiana. Local boys were captivated by her southern accent. One such admirer was 18-year-old Larry Eugene Einen. Evidently, the attraction was mutual because at 17, Jill dropped out of school and married him. The marriage dissolved quickly, within a couple of months. And when Jill left her young husband, she took the only thing he had, $280 earned from his masonry assistant job. Interestingly, divorce at that time required stating a reason. Larry cited cruel and inhumane treatment, while Jill requested a restraining order against him. What exactly transpired between the young couple remains unknown, but Jill was determined not to work a modest factory job. She decided to complete her education and returned to Louisiana to attend acting classes at the university. For 3 years, she managed to focus on her studies, at least not marrying anyone. However, she eventually married another student, Stephen Moore. Unfortunately, even the birth of their son, Seth, could not save their marriage. Jill left Stephen and moved to Texas with their son. Despite how her approach to life and marriage would change in the future, she didn't gain much financially from her first two marriages. While fully aware of her value and attractiveness, Jill secured a job as a model. A beautiful girl caught the eye of successful engineer William Clark Coit Jr. He was unfazed by her two previous marriages and adopted Seth as his own son. Jill claimed that he was the love of her life. Despite her happy marriage to William, Jill didn't divorce her second husband until after the birth of her and William's first child. Their second son was born later. William had more resources than any of her previous husbands, which likely sparked Jill's attraction to substantial wealth, and she eagerly spent it. However, William was often away from home, leading Jill to start having affairs. Upon discovering this, William demanded a divorce. A bitter custody battle ensued. But 3 weeks before the divorce was finalized, tragedy struck. William Coit Jr. was murdered in his own home, shot 3 times in the back with a .22 caliber weapon. Detectives believed he knew his killer since he was shot from behind. Before his death, William had withdrawn a substantial amount of money from his accounts, telling friends he did so to prevent Jill from getting it. Unfortunately, he miscalculated. The money was never found, likely because Jill was the one who discovered William's body when he failed to show up for work. Naturally, the police suspected his 27-year-old widow, Jill. However, she managed to flee to New Orleans and hired a lawyer. On his advice, she admitted herself to a psychiatric hospital. This tactic worked, and the police were unable to question her. Without sufficient evidence to extradite her forcibly, Jill spent a year in the psychiatric facility. After her release, she reclaimed her 3 sons from relatives, secured the money she inherited from William, and moved to California to start anew. In California, Jill tried something new. She met Bruce Johansson, who was over 90 years old. Unable to marry him, she used her charm to persuade him to adopt her. After the man passed away, likely from natural causes, she inherited all his assets, finances, and property. She had no time to mourn because she was preparing for marriage number 4 with Major Donald Brody of the Marine Corps. However, Jill unexpectedly found out that her husband could refuse her access to his funds. Their relationship quickly deteriorated, so she resorted to another way to extract money from him. After a lengthy separation, she delighted him with news of giving birth to a boy named Thaddeus John Brody. The Major didn't believe her. She then showed him a fake birth certificate and asked acquaintances to lend her their child temporarily to show him a son, allegedly theirs. But unable to sustain this, a month later she delivered the Major horrifying news. The child had died and she buried him in the family crypt. Fortunately, it was a lie, and when the crypt was later opened, there was no child inside. Realizing she could no longer gain anything from the Major, Jill divorced him and married a man named Louis A. DeRosa. He was a lawyer she hired after fleeing following the death of her third husband, William. He also assisted her in Bruce Johansson's adoption. Their relationship was tumultuous, with the couple divorcing and reconciling 3 times over many years. During one of their separations, Jill managed to marry husband number 6, Eldon Dwayne Metzger, an auction organizer. This marriage was very short and illegal because she divorced Louis DeRosa in Haiti, a divorce not recognized in the USA. Thus, she was still legally married to Louis when she moved to Indiana and met her 7th husband. 2 of her sons attended school in Indiana, where one of the boys' school director was Carl V. Steele. Jill lived with him for 7 years, which were some of the longest and most normal relationships in her life. Carl treated her and the boys well. He loved skiing and often took the family to Steamboat Springs, Colorado. They enjoyed their time there and dreamed of growing old together in that place. During one of their trips, the couple decided to invest in a business by purchasing a small hotel. Jill convinced Carl that she would handle everything herself because he was a teacher, and she felt more capable of managing finances. The plan was for Jill to move to Steamboat Springs, buy the hotel in both their names, renovate it with their sons, and start managing it. Carl would join her when school holidays began. However, Carl encountered a very unpleasant surprise when he arrived in town. Jill simply ousted him. She persuaded him to say goodbye to his money, convinced him to invest in her business, and he was no longer needed. She registered the hotel under her and her elder son Seth's name only. Carl was left without money and in debt. After less than 10 years together, Jill and Carl parted ways. They didn't finalize their divorce before Jill set her sights on husband number 8, Jerry Boggs, the owner of a store in Steamboat Springs. Investigators found too many coincidences between the two murder cases of Jill's ex-husbands, William and Jerry. Both men were killed with the same caliber weapon, which was never recovered. In both cases, there was no forced entry into the home. Jill knew the layout of the rooms in the house, knew when Jerry would return home from work, and it would not have been difficult for her to catch William at home in the evening while he watched TV. But the similarities didn't end there. Jill had a financial motive in both crimes. However, when investigators talked to Jill, it turned out she had alibis. In the same month she annulled her marriage to Jerry, she finally divorced Carl Steele, so she was not married to anyone at the time, perhaps a new feeling for her. Instead, she was dating a telephone technician named Michael Backus. During her conversation with investigators, Jill stated that she and Michael were camping in Poudre Canyon, 240 kilometers away from the crime scene. To set up a tent in that location, they had to fill out a form and pay a fee. This meant that Jill could prove she was in Poudre Canyon if needed. Therefore, she was too far away by the evening of October 21st to have killed Jerry. Investigators decided they needed to pinpoint the exact time frame when the attack on Jerry occurred. A crucial piece of evidence was studying the contents of his stomach. Jerry Boggs was a creature of habit. He opened his store at the same time every day. Then at 11 a.m., he went to a restaurant for breakfast where he always ate the same meal: hash browns, eggs, and toast. Specialists used plant cells, which, unlike protein-based foods, pass through the digestive system unchanged. They determined that Jerry had consumed onions. However, the restaurant chef did not add onions to the hash browns, eggs, or toast. This indicated that Jerry had indeed eaten his meal, meaning he was killed closer to the evening of October 21st, when Jill had an alibi. Thus, Jill had a motive, but no opportunity to kill him. If Jill didn't kill him, who did? Perhaps the unidentified hunters who had frightened Jerry's neighbor. However, the police had no leads on how to find them. Then, on a hunch, one of the investigators visited the restaurant where Jerry had breakfast and stood in the kitchen, observing the chef at work. He noticed that although the chef didn't add onions to the hash browns, he used the same spatula to mix them as he did with onions. This contamination could explain why onion particles were found in Jerry's system. It indicated that he was killed 3 hours after breakfast, a time frame during which Jill didn't have an alibi. Furthermore, the police couldn't find the form she supposedly filled out for the Poudre Canyon visit. This meant she hadn't been camping with her boyfriend and they had both lied. Interestingly, while the police awaited the results from Jerry's stomach contents, Jill managed to get married again, possibly for the last time. When unpleasant rumors began circulating about her in Steamboat Springs, she left for Las Vegas, where she seduced Roy Carroll, a retired Navy officer. However, before the end of the year, she left him and reunited with Michael Backus. According to some sources, she married him. Although no marriage certificate was found, she used his surname in any case. Meanwhile, gathering only circumstantial evidence, the police managed to obtain a search warrant for the suspect's car. Inside, they found maps of Mexico, a couple of wigs, and a stun gun. The discovery of the stun gun prompted the police to exhume Jerry's body to conduct several tests. It turned out that the marks on the victim's face matched those from this weapon. Additionally, the wigs found in Jill's car matched the description of the appearance of the two hunters observed by Jerry's neighbor on the day of his murder. However, the police were unable to arrest the accomplices because they had disappeared. The case would have stalled if not for unexpected assistance from a surprising source: Jill's eldest son, Seth. He called the police and revealed that his mother had asked him to help cover up Jerry's murder and dispose of the body. However, Seth liked Jerry and refused to assist. He informed the police that when the net started closing in on their associates, Jill and Michael traveled to California, crossed by boat from San Diego to Tijuana, then to Mexico City, and finally to Spain. Without Seth's cooperation, Jill might never have been apprehended. However, just a week later, she decided to return to the United States, where police officers tracked her down. Some speculate that she ran out of money. In any case, returning was an incredible risk, bringing her not only back to the country, but also to Steamboat Springs, where she drove around town in her own car, seemingly unfazed by the danger. On December 23, 1993, Jill and Michael were arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Even during questioning, Jill behaved provocatively, attempting to flirt with detectives and vehemently asserting her innocence. She was nearly 50 years old, but had never faced serious legal consequences despite her numerous marriages without proper divorces, document forgery, identity theft, insurance fraud, and being a potential suspect in her third husband's murder. She firmly believed that money ruled the world and that she was untouchable. The trial began in 1995. One by one, witnesses took the stand, including Michael Backus's colleague, who testified that Jill and Michael had tried to persuade them to kill Jerry Boggs, citing false claims that he had harmed a young girl and deserved to die. However, Jerry was a respected member of society, and these claims did not hold up under scrutiny. Furthermore, after her breakup with Jerry, Jill posed as a psychologist, ostensibly helping flood victims. During one session, she asked a client for a gun and offered $1,000 to kill Jerry Boggs. Naturally, the client declined this shocking proposal, especially given the context of seeking professional help for trauma. This incident underscored Jill's audacious approach to manipulating others for her own ends. When their associates failed to find someone willing to commit the murder, Jill and Michael decided to take matters into their own hands. Michael and Jill fabricated a camping trip in the canyon. However, they used this as an opportunity to practice disguising themselves. On the appointed day, they walked the streets disguised as a pair of hunters. Jill wore a mustache, wig, beard, and men's clothing. Investigators believe their accomplices entered through the back door and waited for the victim, lying in wait. After Jerry finished work early and returned home around noon, the killers immobilized him using an electroshock gun. They then beat him with a shovel and attempted to strangle him. When that failed, according to detectives, Jill shot her ex-husband 3 times. Later, she called her son Seth and said, "It's over. It's very messy." As Seth testified in court, he knew she was referring to Jerry's murder. Indeed, his testimony proved crucial in convincing the jurors of the guilt of the accomplices. It took them 5 hours to convict both of first-degree murder and conspiracy. Each received a life sentence plus an additional 48 years for conspiracy, along with a $1 million fine. Clearly, the fine was intended to prevent them from profiting from any movie or book deals about their story. But even this didn't stop Jill. She advertised herself as a green card for anyone willing to marry her. When this project failed, in 2002 she claimed she was subjected to violence and abuse in prison, and her rights were violated. She alleged that a guard had assaulted her and broken her finger. Additionally, she claimed she was denied special orthopedic devices for arthritis. She attempted similar claims in 2006, but they were not believed. Despite filing appeals, all were rejected. Some might say living in marriage is like being in prison anyway. But for Jill Coit, this prison became a lifelong reality. Jill was furious with Jerry because he dared to stand in her way and thwarted her plans. Not only did he refuse to let her sell the hotel, but a private detective hired by his family had gathered enough evidence to expose her. Jerry intended to bring her to justice in court, revealing who she truly was and what she had done, so she couldn't deceive anyone else. However, like William, Jerry never got the chance to confront Jill face-to-face in court. Both men were killed just days before the trial was set to begin. The murder of Jill's third husband was never solved. Jerry died trying to stop a predator, paying a high price for the truth. While Jill had no trouble cycling through men in her life, she didn't easily let go of their money. For the money she believed rightfully hers, she fought to the death, literally in their deaths.